Hello and welcome to Unacademy IAS English, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. A very good morning and welcome to the daily Hindu news analysis. So let's begin today's discussion by first looking at the topics that we are going to discuss. From the Delhi edition of the Hindu, I have chosen 7 important articles. So let's analyze all these articles comprehensively, so that you don't have to go back and read the newspaper again. If you guys are benefiting from our initiatives, do support us with your likes and comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Before we start, I have a very important announcement. The Republic Day offer, which I announced yesterday as well, has been extended by Unacademy on popular demand. The offer is available till 31st of Jan, where you can avail our IAS courses at a 60% discount. The 12-month and 18-month subscription is available at just 23,499 and 24,999. This will give you access to all the live classes along with the study material, the test series, and one-on-one mentorship and doubt resolution sessions. To avail the offer, all you have to do is to enter the code IAS English. Now, along with this discount, we are also offering CSE Assure. That is, in a worst case scenario, if you don't clear the exam with your first attempt, right? We guarantee that there will be a free extension for 2026 aspirants. So do avail of this offer immediately. The link is provided in the description as well. And don't forget to enter the code IAS English to get the 60% flat discount. With this, let's get started with today's discussion. But do ensure you join the Telegram channel as well, because after the session ends, I'll be sharing the PDF of the session on my Telegram channel. So please scan the QR code and also join the official Telegram channel of Unacademy IAS English. The link is provided in the video description, because after the session, we'll conduct a daily quiz on these topics so you can revise them again. So let's begin the discussion by looking at a very important development, a tragic development from the Mahakumbh Mela. In today's newspaper, we have an article on the front page and also an editorial related to the stampede that was reported at the Mahakumbh Mela in Prayagraj in Uttar Pradesh. As you all know, the Mahakumbh Mela, which is the largest of such gatherings in the entire world, is one of the most important pilgrimages in Hinduism. The government of Uttar Pradesh puts in lot of effort to organize this mega event, as almost 400 million devotees were expected during the entire Mahakumbh Mela season. And just yesterday, which was a very sacred event, the Mauni Amavayas Divas, on which the Amrit Snan is carried out, close to 100 million pilgrims, that is almost 10 crore people were expected. Now see, imagine, please put this into context. The population of Uttar Pradesh itself is 24 million. 241 million, that is around 24 crores. Imagine handling an additional surge of around 100 million, that is around 10 crore people more, just on a single day. According to government statistics, almost on a daily basis, the Mahakumbh Mela has been receiving around 4 to 5 crore pilgrims, 40 to 50 million pilgrims. Since Mauni Amavayas was a more sacred event, 100 million people are expected, close to 10 crore people. The state's population itself is around 24 crores, 241 million. So imagine handling such mass events, managing such mass crowds. This is a Herculean task. Just look at the logistics that are needed to organize the event. From providing basic facilities from food and water and shelter to security and safety, including emergency services. It's an absolute logistical and administrative nightmare. But UP and the other states where the Kumbh Melas are held, be it in Nashik, Ujjain, Haridwar, across these places, the Kumbh Mela is organized quite well by the local administration with the help of the state governments. And especially at Prayagraj, given that the Mahakumbh Mela, which is a once in 144-year event, the crowds that were expected, the state government, the local administration was adequately prepared. They put in a lot of measures, including the deployment of drones, AI-based surveillance cameras, tracking of mobile data, so that they can anticipate the crowds and manage the crowds. Well-planned exits were created. Large residential facilities, temporary tents were set up. But despite all the arrangements, the tragedy has occurred. The worst case scenario has happened, with 30 people reported dead yesterday. Most likely it was triggered by a panic event. According to reports, maybe a barricade broke, and this led to a sudden mass movement of the crowd, resulting in many people getting crushed. And as a result, 30 people have lost their lives. More than 60 injuries have been reported. But what was shocking was the state government even tried to deny and try to undermine the reports initially. Even the editorial points towards this, because generally when such tragedies, disasters occur, governments are expected to be as transparent as possible. Generally, governments are very transparent when it comes to such casualty events. But yesterday, attempts were made to underplay the incident, to downplay the death count. But reports are very clear that 30 deaths have been reported with several injuries. So this is not the first time that we are witnessing such a stampede in India. In recent times itself, we have had deadly stampedes occurring back to back. Just a couple of weeks ago in Tirupati, there was a deadly stampede. Again, a very important Hindu pilgrimage site. A deadly stampede resulted in the loss of lives at Tirupati as well. And by the way, even this incident occurred on a very important event when Vaikunta Ekadasi was being marked. So this tells you a lot about stampedes. It tells you a lot about how stampedes have to be managed, how we can anticipate large crowds, especially at mass gatherings such as religious events. So this is the topic that we need to learn and understand here. I would like to move beyond the article and the editorial and give you some insight into stampedes, because it is a type of man-made disaster. The topic can be very relevant under disaster management, as stampedes are preventable man-made disasters. With the right planning and measures, with adequate preparation, definitely stampedes are preventable. So since these are preventable man-made disasters, it's very essential to understand the dynamics of a stampede. Why does a stampede occur? What is a stampede in the first place? How can you prepare for such mass events where large crowds are expected? It's not only religious gatherings where such mass crowd is expected, but even at political rallies, for example, or maybe at large events. Could be a sporting match, a cricket match, for example, or a concert like the Coldplay concert that attracts massive crowds. So any such mass gathering event could result in a tragic stampede. It could be religious gatherings, it could be political rallies, or it could be even large events such as a sporting event or a concert. So stampedes are most likely to occur at such mass gatherings where there is a large crowd. But what is interesting is that we have seen stampedes occur even with smaller crowds. For example, at metro stations, especially during rush hour, right, when there is a sudden rush of the crowd, or even at airports and at other smaller places where there is a smaller crowd present, maybe just a group of large people, if not in hundreds and thousands, in double digits. Even such crowds have witnessed stampede situations where people have lost their lives or people have been very seriously injured. So don't think stampedes are a feature of only mass gatherings. You don't need thousands and lakhs of people to be assembled for a stampede to occur. Even in small crowds, a stampede situation can occur, and we have seen examples of that. So last year we had a deadly stampede incident, the Hathras Satsang stampede incident, where many people lost their lives. Again, it was a religious mass gathering. In South Korea, you might remember, recently there was a concert that led to a stampede where many people lost their lives. So in the past, we have seen many such incidents. In Russia, in India, and in many other countries, we have seen such tragic events where many people get killed. So this is nothing but a man-made disaster which is entirely preventable. So to understand the disaster management aspect about stampede, you need to know what is a stampede, why does a stampede occur? Why do people lose their lives? What are the dynamics involved in a stampede? Because when you put together a large group of people in a crowd, the entire crowd behaves like one organism. The crowd itself has its own dynamic. Though the crowd is made up of thousands and hundreds of individuals, collectively the crowd becomes one organism which has one dynamic to it. So experts define a stampede as an impulsive mass movement of a crowd that often results in injuries and deaths. When there is a mass gathering, a large group of people, and if there is a sudden impulsive movement, this could result in people falling over each other or some people getting crushed in the crowd, which results in injuries and eventual death. It is also defined as a disruption of the orderly movement of crowds. Now imagine there is a large gathering or a queue where people are moving in a certain order, in a certain direction. As I said, the crowd has its own dynamic. The crowd is like a living organism. So the crowd is moving in one direction. If there is something that disrupts the movement suddenly, let's say there is a rumor which has spread, a rumor that some fire has been triggered, right? Rest of the crowd who don't know whether it's true or not, they'll panic. And this panic is enough to trigger the impulsive behavior of the crowd, where human psychology, human survival instinct takes over. So as people become more self-centered and individualistic in a crowd, when people start looking after their own self-interest and safety, they might take certain irrational steps which will harm the collective interests of the crowd. This is where stampedes become extremely deadly and dangerous. See, we generally expect humans to be rational actors, but in a crowd situation, the crowd mentality takes over. The human psychology plays a very big role here. Whether there is a real threat or a perceived threat or just a rumor or maybe a sudden loss of physical space, because sometimes in large crowded areas or in queues, a barricade might break, or a structure which has been created to manage the crowd might collapse because of the large volume of the crowd. So such loss of physical space or any such event, right, which can induce panic or spread rumors which can in turn trigger panic, will result in human psychology coming into play, where the crowd mentality takes over, the dynamics of the crowd takes over, where individuals will start looking after their own self-interest, their own immediate survival instinct will kick in, and this could be detrimental to the survival of the entire crowd. So that is where the orderly movement of the crowd gets broken, where people start rushing towards the exit, blocking the exit, and eventually leading into a bigger situation which could result in many people getting crushed or stamped over, that will result in the injuries and deaths. So to understand why people lose their lives in a stampede, you need to look at the reasons. Studies have clearly established in such a stampede situation where people are getting crushed by a mass of people, most of the deaths occur due to asphyxia, traumatic asphyxia, where people struggle to breathe. The space becomes so constrained in a crowded environment, in crowded queues and in crowded gatherings, that when there is a sudden impulsive movement of the crowd in one direction or the other, resulting in a stampede situation, many people who are especially in the middle, who get trapped, who get trapped in between, they will struggle to breathe as there isn't enough space for them to draw in oxygen. So asphyxia is the primary factor. There is also a possibility where people in the middle or those who have been pushed down to the ground, they might be stamped over by the rest of the crowd. So this could lead to very serious injuries to the thorax, a crushing of the thorax or the upper abdomen or the chest cavity. The rib cage could get compressed and crushed when large crowds stamp over people and push people around. So the force created by the crowd as a dynamic entity is enough to crush people and create a compression of the chest, the upper abdomen and the thoracic area, which can make it extremely difficult and almost impossible for people to breathe. So those who are trapped in the middle of the crowd during a stampede-like situation, they will die because of asphyxia, because they can't draw in enough oxygen. The other reasons include serious physical injuries. It could be serious injuries to the internal organs, especially when people have been trampled over and the crowd is stamping on the people who have been crushed. Right? People are just interested in their own safety. They're rushing towards the exit because they see a threat or they have perceived a threat. So as people are rushing without caring about the rest of the people and the rest of the crowd, they might end up stamping on several people or crushing several people where internal organ injuries could be reported. This could become fatal very easily. Serious head and neck injuries are also very common. And also, blood flow could be affected. Blood flow could be constricted when people get compressed in a stampede situation, which results in heart attacks or myocardial infarction, where people lose their lives. So these are the different causes which contribute to deaths, the casualties in a stampede situation. Now, it's very important to understand the role of human psychology here. Before we talk about how these events should be organized, what measures can be taken from an administrative point of view, from a disaster management point of view, before we discuss that, let's understand the human psychology at play. See, in any mass gathering, as I said, the crowd mentality is different, the crowd dynamic is entirely different, and the individuals who make up that crowd have a different intent. For example, if you've ever been to Rajiv Chowk in Delhi, the central metro station in Delhi, you would have experienced this crowd mentality, how it precedes individual interest and how individuals try to act on their own, which could be detrimental to the crowd well-being. In Rajiv Chowk metro station, if you've ever been to this metro station in Delhi, right, when the metro trains arrive, you don't even have to get into the train. The crowds are so massive during rush hour that even if you're just standing there, standing idle without moving one step, the crowd will push you into the train and take you out of the train. You almost have no control over yourself, right? You can't move in the direction you want because the crowd dynamics, the crowd mentality is at play, where the crowd will determine in which direction you will move. Whether you'll get into the train or not, whether you'll get out of the train or not, is determined by the crowd, not by the individuals. Because each individual is acting according to their self-interest. Everybody wants to rush in and get a seat. Everyone wants to exit quickly. So as individual interests take over, which is pure human psychology at work, this is pure human survival instinct, a self-interest. This affects the overall well-being of the entire crowd. Now, in such a situation, easily mishaps can occur. Imagine in the Delhi metro station where individuals have no freedom to move around, where crowd is basically determining the movement. One mistake or one panic situation, one trigger, let's say a rumor spreads that a fire has started. Let's say a rumor spreads that there is a terror attack. This is enough to trigger an impulsive movement of the mass crowd where many people could get crushed, or worse, they could be pushed onto the railway track, or they could get crushed between the metro train and the platform. So such tragic incidents can occur very easily in such a crowd situation. See, in a metro station, maximum you'll have few thousand people. So, right, even that crowd is enough to create a stampede situation where people can lose their lives. So imagine what can happen in large gatherings, in religious gatherings such as the Hathras Satsang stampede that occurred last year. This was purely a result of mismanagement by this religious cult, this so-called spiritual cult. The pure mismanagement, the negligence of this entity led to more than 100 people losing their lives just because they wanted to catch a glimpse of a so-called God man or a so-called spiritual figure. So even when people sense an opportunity, even then such situations can develop. Imagine there is a cricket match going on and suddenly there is a rumor that Virat Kohli has entered the spectator stand. When people hear that, whether it's true or not, everybody wants to rush and get a glimpse of Virat Kohli. People have something to gain where they are pushed towards a certain direction. Or let's say someone says free food is being offered in one part of the gathering. People will rush towards that location. But all of a sudden, an impulsive movement of the mass crowd resulting in a sudden disorderly movement which can lead to stampedes. So human psychology plays a very big role in crowd dynamics. Individually, we think we are rational actors, but in such situations, most of us become self-centered. We think of our self-interests. Be it the opportunity to catch a glimpse of someone who is important, or maybe a celebrity, or to grab something which is attractive, or a panic or a rumor or an actual threat, right? Let's say a fire has started, or let's say rumors have spread about a possible threat to the event. Immediately you will see a disorderly movement of the crowd where individual interest will take over. This will harm the collective interest of the crowd. See, even in such panic situations, if the crowd moves and mobilizes in an orderly manner, if the crowd acts as one organism and moves in orderly fashion towards the exits, the stampede will not occur. You can still ensure everybody will exit safely. But only when individual interests take over and human psychology comes into play, that's where the crowd mentality takes over. The herd mentality, as we call it, right? You might have heard about warnings in airplanes as well, where the air hostesses, before the flight takes off, they warn you that if at all there is an emergency on board, please move in an orderly fashion. Don't rush towards the exit. Everybody will get a chance, will get an opportunity to exit the plane in such an event. Because the moment you rush, the crowd rushes towards the exit without caring about others, thinking only about their personal safety. That's when it leads to blockage of exits. See, exits are designed for a reason. It's designed to handle such emergency events, and it can only handle the crowd only when there is an orderly movement. But if everybody thinks of their own personal safety and rushes towards the exit, it creates a bottleneck. It will disrupt and block the exits, resulting in delayed evacuation. That is when the disasters will actually occur. So in mass gatherings, it's important to maintain one's calm. And people generally need to have that awareness as well, because human psychology is at work here. Crowd mentality, the crowd dynamic takes over, where the individual interest will basically harm the collective interest of the crowd. Now, this is not my personal opinion. Studies have established this. Sociologists, psychologists have studied crowd behavior. They have studied why stampedes happen. They attribute this to the craze mentality of the crowd. In theory of collective behavior, popular sociologist Neil J. Smeltzer, he argues that sometimes crowds may be acting rationally, or sometimes they might be acting irrationally. Individuals might be seeking to fulfill their own individual wish, which is their own personal safety or personal gratification. And this might result in an individualistic mindset. And imagine if the entire crowd is driven by self-interest, it will harm the collective interest of the crowd. So that is what you see in a stampede situation. Now, how do you manage this? How do you contain this? Take the example of the recent stampede that occurred in Tirupati. It again occurred on a major religious event when Vaikuntha Ekadasi was being celebrated, where large crowds were anticipated. Just like at Mahakumbh Mela on Mauni Amavyas, large crowds were expected. The administration had prepared for it. But still the disaster happened. Because in Tirupati, for example, if you look at the incident, how it started, in a large crowded area, a report came out that an elderly woman was having breathing difficulty. Large crowds were waiting for collecting tokens for the darshan of Lord Venkateshwara at Tirupati, and information was received by the police and the authorities that an elderly woman is struggling to breathe inside this crowded area. So the authorities and policemen created a small opening. They opened one of the barricades to enter into the crowd so that they could rescue this woman, so that they could safely bring this woman out and provide medical emergency aid to this woman. But as the police created one opening and tried entering the crowd, some people assumed that the entry gates for darshan was opened, that now they could move forward and collect the tokens. Because see, every individual in this crowd in Tirupati on that tragic day, they were desperately waiting for the gates to be opened so that they could rush and get the tokens and quickly finish their darshan. This was their self-interest. They had no idea that the police were moving in, creating a small opening to rescue one of the women who was having breathing difficulties. So the moment the crowd assumed that the tokens were being issued and now that darshan might happen, they rushed in one direction. The crowd moved in one sudden direction, resulting in the collapse of people who were especially trapped in between. That is where the deaths were reported. People died out of asphyxia and traumatic injuries that were caused because of the stampede situation. Rest of the crowd may not even realize, they may not even notice that other people are getting trapped, that others are getting crushed, others are not able to breathe. So the crowd may not even have this realization. So that is where stampedes become more dangerous and deadly. So that is why individual interest, human psychology is the biggest detriment for crowd dynamics. So, to manage a large crowd, what you need is planning. Planning and preparedness can prevent such tragedies from occurring. If you plan accordingly, prepare accordingly, put in place the right measures, that is when such situations can be prevented or tackled in a better manner. See, those who organize these large events, any kind of large gathering, it could be a religious event, a political gathering, or a sporting event, or a concert. The organizers, the administrators, they have a critical responsibility. The organizers of the event have to ensure that even in a panic setting, in a large crowd, panic might get created. You may have no control over this. Rumors might spread or unnecessary panic might get created. Maybe a barricade breaks or some structure will collapse. People will panic and start running. So you need to anticipate such events, such triggers which can lead to the impulsive movement of the crowd, and put in place measures to manage the crowd effectively. You need to ensure that the area is well lit. Visibility, ventilation, and breathability of the venue is very important. So that is why when you're organizing a mass event, choosing the right venue is very important. You can't hold a massive concert in a small auditorium, right? In auditorium which can fit 10,000 people, you can't try to fit in 20,000 people, right? Because if such a event transpires, eventually it will result in a tragedy. So the venue choice has to be appropriate, keeping in mind the light and ventilation and the breathability factor. Then how will you manage the flow of the crowd? The authorities, the organizers have to ensure that they need to break the crowd if required, split the crowd into different units, into different modules, and thus manage the crowd in smaller numbers. That's why you might have seen in many large gatherings, different queues are created, different lines or different groups are created, or people are brought in different segments, so that at one time there is no sudden rush of the masses. Just like how boarding in an airplane happens in a sequential manner according to your seat number. This basically prevents the overcrowding of the pathway, right? The same method has to be employed by the organizers to divert and divide the crowd if necessary, and ensure that all the structures present are well secured. It could be barricades which are put up to manage the crowd, right? Or any temporary structure or permanent structure which has been created at the facility, at the venue. It should ensure that the safety of the structure is maintained. The authorities have to ensure, the organizers have to ensure that they use good quality material, and the structures which are built, temporary or permanent structures, they have to be well designed, well constructed, because if there is a collapse of these structures, that is what induces panic, right? Especially barricade breaking in a crowded event is the primary trigger for stampedes, because people will suddenly fall over. Imagine hundreds of people contained in a barricaded area and barricades collapse. Automatically those who are leaning on those barricades, they will fall, and the whole crowd moves in that direction as if it's one entity, as if it's one organism. And if someone assumes that gates have been opened, they'll start rushing, stamping over others and crushing others who have fallen down. So for that, you need to ensure that the structures are well built. You need to ensure exits are well planned. There should be sufficient exits. There should be no bottlenecks. None of the exits should be blocked. There should be evacuation routes and emergency protocols in place. If at all there is a panic situation, authorities and organizers should know how to evacuate the people, how to safely bring out the crowd. The overall design of the venue is critical. How do you design the entrance, the exits, and what methods are you using to monitor the crowd? This is very critical. You need to have adequate cameras in place so that there is real-time monitoring and surveillance. If there is any sudden disruption, sudden movement, authorities can intervene and step in. You need to deploy adequate security personnel who can manage the crowd, who can guide the crowd in the right direction, help the people who are getting crushed. You need to have medical services, emergency services on standby, and you should also contain all the fire hazards. Ensure that there is no accidental fire which gets triggered off in a large event. and that is what will lead to a stampede. So there is a set protocol for disaster management when it comes to stampedes. That's why I told you it's a preventable disaster. With the right planning, with the right resources and right coordination between organizers and administrators, right? Definitely stampedes can be prevented. So you can anticipate a mains question on this topic in disaster management. So please take a look at this schematic that provides a structured approach for planning and preparedness with regard to stampedes. Right from the moment a decision is taken to hold such a large event, to risk reduction measures as to what measures have to be implemented to prevent and deal with such tragedies. Step-by-step approach is given in this infographic. You can try to use this table, right? Try to depict some of these steps under these headings so that you can clearly illustrate your viewpoint in a mains answer. When you're planning such a large venue, right, authorities have to first determine whether it's a religious gathering, political gathering, or a recreational event. Accordingly, they have to determine the duration of the event, whether it's indoor, outdoor, what is the venue. Is there any history of such tragedies occurring? For example, you look at the Hajj pilgrimage in Mecca. There is a history of such stampedes. Saudi authorities took a lot of measures to contain and prevent such stampedes from occurring. So, historical incidents will give you a lot of information, right? In India as well, several religious gatherings have seen such stampedes. So, that itself is a lesson. So, before the decision is taken even to hold the event and organize the event, these factors have to be considered. Organizers have to approach the authorities to get the approvals. You need to put in place a regulatory mechanism for such events, a licensing mechanism, where the organizers have to obtain approvals from the local municipal corporation, from the local government, from the police, the fire department. Ensure adequate emergency facilities are created. They should share all the details of the expected crowd size. What safety measures are they taking? Based on that, permits and licenses have to be given. A thorough risk assessment has to be done. The authorities, especially the police, with local government officials, have to come out with the organizers and check the venue before the event. Plan the exits and the routes, the barricades properly. Ensure they can scientifically manage the crowd by dividing them into smaller groups. Ensure there are proper entry-exit points. Ensure all the safety measures are incorporated. And ensure all resources are available, all emergency protocols are in place. For example, provision of drinking water and food, providing standby medical teams. So doctors, paramedics are readily available to treat those who suffer any kind of medical emergency. Or if there is a stampede-like situation, to treat those who are injured, to save lives, you need medical teams on standby. If there is a fire incident, you need fire emergency services. You need enough security personnel. You need real-time surveillance with a control room monitoring the movement of the crowd. There should be 24/7 constant surveillance through cameras, drones, and everything should be monitored live in a control room. So accordingly, authorities can step in and contain and manage the crowd. So if you can bring out these steps and list them out in a structured manner like this, that is more than sufficient for any such question on stampedes. Since we have seen 3 deadly stampedes in India back to back, I anticipate a mains question on this topic. So please take up this question for your answer writing practice. That's why I have moved beyond the article and given a detailed explanation of what is a stampede, why does it occur, what's the psychology of the crowd, right? How do you manage such crowds, and what can we do from a disaster management perspective to deal with stampedes. So I hope the topic is clear to everyone. Now let's look at the next article. On page number 8, we have a very interesting column related to the union budget. As the government of India prepares to present the budget in a couple of days, we have plenty of articles related to the budget. So this article here is focused on the previous budgets and India's growth story. How India's growth has progressed over the last few decades and what's happening currently. Because right now, the Indian economy is facing a lot of stress. In recent years, Indian economy has come under a lot of pressure. You might be aware that the GDP growth for India has been revised downwards. The provisional GDP estimates show that India's GDP might grow at just around maybe 6.4% from the previous expected 8+%. The government, even the RBI, was pretty confident that India will easily register 7.5 to 8% and above growth. But revised estimates are clearly showing that the growth might just be around 6%, even dropping to 5% in the coming days. So this slowdown in India's GDP, right, and the slowdown in demand and consumption is something that is being explored in this article here. The writers are focusing on government's fiscal expenditure through the budget and how it is related to the growth prospects of India. Because eventually the growth of the economy will have an impact on not just the big industries, but the common man. So the writers are trying to provide some historical context to see how budgets and fiscal allocation has affected our growth prospects. See, in economy, it is very well established that to drive economic growth, to boost your GDP, to drive overall growth in the economy, you need to drive consumption. When I say consumption, I'm referring to private consumption, right? That is what we buy, be it food, the recreational activities we carry out, or luxury items that we purchase. Whatever we spend money on, right, as common people, whatever you spend your money on, that is private consumption. So if private demand is missing, if the consumption demand is low, that is the biggest red flag for the economy. Because when there isn't enough demand created through private consumption, private investors will largely stay away from investing fresh capital. Why will private companies or corporates invest more when their existing capacity is not being fully utilized? So private investments will freeze when there is a fall in demand and private consumption. And this is the biggest detrimental factor for GDP growth. So one thing is very clear, to drive growth, you need to boost demand, you need to boost consumption so that you can bring in private investments, creating a virtuous cycle of growth and investment. Now, one reason why consumption demand might fall is because people may not have enough money in their hands. Obviously, our ability to spend is dependent on the money that we have, right? Money doesn't grow on trees. You need to work, you need to earn that money. So people who earn wages in particular, salaries in particular, they are entirely dependent on private investments, right? So wages and salaries play a determining role in defining the ability of the people to spend. If wages, salaries are higher, obviously people will have more money in their hands to spend, demand will be higher, consumption goes up, and this is great for the economy. So for people to get more wages and salaries, there should be private investment, creating more jobs, where private capital can result in economic prosperity for the common people and the masses, so people can use that money to spend, driving demand and consumption, and this will create the virtuous cycle that I was talking about. If demand is sustained, private investment will also sustain. Now you might say, sir, what about government expenditure? Government expenditure is a critical factor, without doubt. Government expenditure plays a defining role in determining growth prospects and in determining the money that people will eventually have in their hands. Now, the writers, they divide the last 3 decades into different periods. From 1991 to 2004, 2004 to 2011, and 2012 to 2023. In the post-LPG era, writers are dividing the last 3 decades into these 3 timelines in order to present a very interesting analysis. According to the writers and the data they have collected, India's best growth period was between 2004 and 2011. We saw sustained GDP growth under the then Manmohan Singh government. There was job creation, demand sustained as well, consumption remained higher. More importantly, there was reduction of absolute poverty. Absolute poverty levels went down drastically as India lifted millions of people out of poverty. So data clearly shows that in the post-LPG era, the best period for India's growth was 2004 to 2011. The LPG reforms, which started in 91-92, it basically laid the foundation. It paved the path, created the opening needed for the economy. By 2004, there was adequate public investment, private capital, foreign investment flowing in, which created sufficient jobs, driving demand and consumption, leading to a virtuous cycle of growth and development. But post 2011, from 2012, we have seen major downside risks. Especially since 2019, the downside risk for the Indian economy has gone up. There were many disruptive events, starting with demonetization, that had a huge impact on the ability of the people to spend money. Then came the flawed implementation of GST. Many experts have pointed out that the implementation of GST in an ad hoc, haphazard manner had a detrimental impact on the economy. It led to slowdown on the production side, on the supply side. Then came the deadly pandemic, resulting in lockdowns and restrictions and shutdown of the economy, which had a huge disruptive impact. So these events have aggravated the risk present for the Indian economy, which has affected demand and consumption levels. Now, this is where the writers are urging the government to draw a lesson from the 2004 to 2011 period. Even in this period, there were challenges. For example, the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, the biggest recession, which led to slowdown in global demand, in global investments. It definitely hit the Indian economy as well, but India managed to tide over. The reason why India managed to do well from 2004 to 2011 is primarily because government expenditure on social welfare remained substantially higher. If you remember, the Manmohan Singh government came out with several welfare schemes, right-based welfare programs, be it Manrega or the National Rural Livelihood Mission, or be it the right to food, which was guaranteed as a legal right. So several such interventions were carried out in the social sector, which put money in the hands of the people, especially in the hands of the rural economy. So this substantially increased rural demand and consumption, driving India's growth, sustaining India's GDP, even when the global economy was in crisis. Of course, the Manmohan Singh government also gave out a huge stimulus package to encourage more investments during the recession period. And that had a huge negative impact later, as it led to build-up of non-performing assets and failed loans. But the provision of social welfare through such schemes and entitlements played a critical role in putting more money in the hands of the people, which increased rural demand and rural consumption. Now, the writers compare this with the policies of the Modi government, where the government has focused more on capital expenditure as compared to social welfare, according to the writers. But see, I do have a point of disagreement here with the writers, which I'll explain in a short while. The writers are pointing out that the government of India has been focusing more on capital expenditure, and in the last few budgets, our capex expenditure has gone up significantly. Now, many experts have praised the Modi government for this, because capital expenditure will create long-term assets. This is how you create long-lasting infrastructure, from roads to your road and railway network and airports and seaports, power plants. They can be created with only such capital expenditure. But writers are making a valid point as well. They are pointing out that if you are crowding out your fiscal expenditure, your fiscal allocation, just on capital expenditure, only a part of this money will land in the hands of the people. Now imagine, let's say, a power project has been taken up for 100 rupees. Hypothetically, let's take an example. Let's say government has allocated 100 rupees for a power plant project. Now, do you think all the 100 rupees will land in the hands of people? No. Only part of it will be paid as salaries and wages to the workers and employees and the related contractors and industries. Rest of it will go for procurement of raw material, right? So only a small part of that 100 rupees will actually land in the hands of people, creating the multiplier effect. This is called employment multiplier. When people get more money in their hands, they'll start spending it. Obviously, what do you do when you get your salary? Right? You go buy new clothes, you order new things online, or you shop for new items. There is expenditure, which is the multiplier effect, and those who basically depend on that, right, they will benefit from this. Maybe you will increase your spending on food. The food vendor, the farmers will benefit from that. Your local supermarket will benefit from that. That in turn will create jobs. So it is a cyclical effect, a multiplier effect. So whatever money is allocated for capital expenditure, only a part of it is reaching people as wages and salaries, creating a multiplier effect. Right? But the positive here is it creates long-term assets. In the long term, it is infrastructure which is needed. Such capital assets are needed to drive growth in the long term. But however, in the short term, this could crowd out investments from welfare. It might lead to lesser money in the hands of people. That's why the writers are saying the government should balance capital expenditure with social welfare. If government allocates more budgetary allocation for social welfare programs that can put more money in the hands of people, this will directly drive up demand. Imagine a government scheme, a direct cash transfer scheme where government is giving that 100 rupees directly to the people. Let's say 10 people receive 10 rupees each, instead of just getting maybe 1 rupee, 2 rupee as a salary in this hypothetical example. People will end up spending that money. That will have a bigger multiplier effect. So this is where the writers are pointing out that the policy from 2004 to 2011 was focused more on social welfare, and that is why India could sustain its GDP growth. But here I have a major disagreement. There is a counter argument we should bring in, which the writers are not bringing in. Otherwise, it becomes a biased argument. The counter argument is that social welfare, yes, it is essential to put more money in the hands of people and to drive consumption and demand. But capital expenditure is equally important to create long-term capital assets, to create infrastructure which is needed for long-term growth. So what we need is a balance, a good balance in the budget where the government allocates sufficient capital for infrastructure projects and provides enough welfare as well, so that there is enough money in the hands of people. So social welfare is a short-term idea to drive consumption and demand. But if implemented well, it can lead to long-lasting social benefits which you can't quantify. So don't think social welfare programs are always wasteful. They're not. Unless and until it's not populist, unless and until it's not a freebie. Today, freebie culture has taken over where every party is promising everything under the sun. But if they are not freebies, if they are well-designed welfare programs, targeted welfare programs, with zero leakages and wastage and corruption, then welfare programs can actually drive long-term socio-economic development. So you can't compromise either of them. Capital expenditure is also essential. Social welfare is also equally essential. So any good budget should balance both the priorities. I think that is what we should take away from the article, because as I said, the writers are giving just one side of the view. They are almost dismissing capital expenditure and just trying to focus on social welfare, which is not appropriate as well. So if you need a balanced approach, you need to understand that capital expenditure is equally important, social welfare is equally important. A good budget should strike a balance between both. So that is what we learned from this important article. So please take up this practice question. Private consumption is a prime driver of growth, but it is directly dependent on social welfare spending by the government. Examine. Now let's look at another article. On page 6, we have a column related to the Paris Agreement, Climate Change Convention, and the recent decision of United States under Donald Trump. See, Donald Trump has always been a climate skeptic. As a right-wing politician aligned with far right-wing ideology, naturally he doesn't believe in the scientific evidence related to climate change. He has even called climate change as a conspiracy theory, as a bogus. He has built his electoral campaign by pointing out that he will continue to protect American fossil fuel interests, that US will continue to release emissions to power its growth, and it will not be curtailed because of the climate change agreement, the Paris Agreement. So in the first term of Donald Trump, when he was the president from 2016 to 2020, even then Donald Trump had taken a stand against the Paris Agreement, which is the current agreement we have under the Climate Change Convention, under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So in the previous term, Donald Trump had exited the Paris Agreement. US had quit the Paris Agreement. it was Joe Biden who brought back the US into Paris Agreement. Now Trump, after coming to power again for the second term, one of the initial decisions he has taken is he has signed an executive order pulling US out of Paris Agreement, and in 1 year's time, US is going to exit the Paris Agreement. So this is going to be a significant blow for global climate action efforts. Because see, before Paris Agreement, we had Kyoto Protocol, which was a legally binding agreement which set legally binding targets for the developed industrialized countries to bring down their emissions. The US was not part of Kyoto Protocol as well. The US never signed and ratified Kyoto Protocol. So it has never really followed any climate restrictions. The only time where US was part of a climate deal was Paris Agreement, and Trump had exited Paris Agreement previously. Biden had brought US back into it, and now Trump has again exited Paris Agreement. So without US being part of the Paris Agreement and the climate change efforts, we are looking at a very dangerous scenario in the future. Because the US has not only been the largest polluter in the past, it remains the largest polluter even today. Though China, India are very quickly catching up and taking over, overall, if you look at the collective cumulative emissions that US has contributed, right, US clearly stands out. Studies have established that US is single-handedly responsible for 1/5 of the total emissions. That's nearly 20% of the total emissions from industrial revolution till date in the last 2 centuries. If you take the overall emissions, US single-handedly has contributed almost 20% of it. That is why US became a developed country. It had all the freedom to burn fossil fuels the way it wanted. It's by burning fossil fuels and by utilizing large part of the carbon budget for itself. That is how US powered its growth. That's how most developed countries powered their growth. They solved their socio-economic problems by freely burning fossil fuels for decades and centuries. This is where the concept of historical responsibilities comes in. Developing countries like India, China, and others, we have championed the concept of historical responsibilities to hold these developed industrialized countries accountable for their historical emissions. At Kyoto Protocol, we championed the CBDR principle, common but differentiated responsibilities. We agreed that fighting climate change is a common responsibility of every country, but the quantum of responsibility should be differentiated from country to country, depending on how much they have contributed for emissions. This was a fair concept. We introduced the concept of fairness and equity into climate change talks. So India played a pivotal role in the adoption of CBDR principle. But US has not really abided by these commitments. It was not part of Kyoto Protocol, and it has been barely part of Paris Agreement. And what US has been doing is not simply sufficient to deal with the global climate change threat that we are facing today. If you look at per capita emissions, the numbers are alarming. The US accounts for one of the highest per capita emissions in the world. On an average, each American citizen contributes about 14 metric tons of carbon dioxide in a year. That is the carbon footprint of an average American. Can you guess what is the per capita emission of an average Indian? It is many, many times lower. It's hardly around 1.8 metric tons of CO2. Just look at the difference. So America's per capita emissions is at least 2.5 to 3 times higher than the global average. Countries like India, many other small developing nations, underdeveloped countries of the global south, their per capita emissions have been negligible, which means they deserve more carbon space in the carbon budget. So they can burn some fossil fuels, which is a cheaper fuel, to provide for their growth and socio-economic development. Whereas the real contribution to tackle emissions has to come from developed industrialized countries, and US is completely trying to escape from this responsibility. So now we need to adapt to this new reality that at least for the next few years, US will not be part of these efforts, and despite this, the world has to focus on climate action. Of course, you can't do it without the US. So India and other countries, they have to continue focusing on multilateral efforts. We should not allow this to undermine the climate change convention. Just because US is exiting Paris Agreement, we should not allow the Paris Agreement to collapse. That would be detrimental to the well-being of the world itself. See, whatever US has pledged It's just bare minimum. You might argue that, sir, US is giving funds for other countries, sharing technology, clean, renewable energy technology. But the efforts of US is bare minimum. And don't think we are just blaming Trump and a certain ideology. Even Biden was no different. The Democrats were no different. In fact, it is under Biden that US became the world's largest, one of the largest oil suppliers. In fact, US saw its highest oil production, the shale gas and shale reserve exploitation, under Biden's administration. If you look at America's commitment made during the Baku Climate Change Summit in Azerbaijan last year, US committed a total of just $300 billion for its climate action efforts, which is just the bare minimum. So don't think this is about one party, one ideology. In general, US administration has not lived up to the expectations and the responsibilities that it has. Though it is accountable for historical responsibilities, US has not taken the required effort. So now the rest of the countries have to find a way out. Even without US, we need to have faith in the multilateral system. That is the only way forward. We need to ensure Paris Agreement and Climate Change Convention survives and continues to be effective. Maybe we can work with US bilaterally. For example, India, US, we do have bilateral initiatives focused on clean energy, renewable energy, climate change, etc. So maybe through the bilateral path, we can try to convince US to do a little more. And every country, all the major powers, the middle powers, need to bring that constant pressure on the US to ensure that it focuses on climate action efforts. Even though if it's not part of Paris Agreement, it should continue to focus on climate action efforts. And that can only be done if global pressure is built on the US. The Trump administration should be brought under global pressure while we continue our multilateral path through Paris Agreement. So that is what we take away from here, because without US, we won't be able to deal with the global warming threat that we are facing. Right? IPCC assessment reports already present a very alarming picture. Right? If you look at the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it paints a very alarming picture, and you can't keep the rise in global temperatures within the target of Paris Agreement without US playing a big role, without the American contribution. So if not through Paris Agreement, other countries should bilaterally exert pressure on the US so that US remains committed to some of its climate goals. And parallelly, the other countries, India, China, European countries, and all the emerging economies, they have to collectively work together, remain committed to the Paris Agreement. So that is something we can take away from this important article. Right? You learn about the impact of US exiting Paris Agreement, what will be the consequence on climate action efforts, and how should the world deal with the American exit from Paris Agreement. Now let's take a quick look at the smaller articles in today's newspaper. Let's look at the prelim section. ISRO has achieved a major milestone. Yesterday, ISRO launched its 100th mission. So it was a century for ISRO. The 100th mission has been carried out, where a GSLV F-15 that contains an indigenous cryogenic stage, it lifted off from Sriharikota, which was a proud moment for ISRO and India, as it marks the 100th successful launch. And this mission was carrying a critical payload. The second generation of Navik satellites, NVS-02, was deployed into the right orbit. So here you need to understand what is Navik. Navigation through Indian constellation. Navik, also known as IRNSS, Indian Regional Navigation Satellite System. It is the Indian miniature version of a global positioning system. If the US has GPS that provides global positioning services and navigational information, then India has built its own regional variant known as Navik, Navigation through Indian Constellation of Satellites, or IRNSS, Indian Regional Navigation Satellite System. See, to provide such navigational services and positional information, you need a constellation of satellites. Right? The American GPS needs a minimum of 36 satellites in geostationary orbit. Similarly, other countries, right, they have built their own global positioning systems. Russia, then China, and European Union. They all have their own variants of the American GPS. They have their own global positioning systems. Now, can you find out the names of these global positioning systems? So this is a small exercise for all of you, a small homework, small assignment. Please find out the names of the global positioning system of Russia, China, and European Union. Please mention that in the comments. So India has been trying to build a regional system because having a global positioning system right away would be very expensive, cost prohibitive for India. So we are focused on building a regional navigation system that will provide coverage up to 1,500 kilometers beyond India's landmass. That is in the immediate vicinity of India, because this is our primary area of strategic influence. This is our primary area of interest. So in a region extending up to 1,500 kilometers from India's boundaries, Navik satellite constellation provides positional navigational information and services. Now this will have both civilian and military application. Civilian application would be your regular navigational services and positional services. I'm sure when you're driving, when you're riding your vehicles, right, many of you will be using navigational devices, right? Or look at various apps, from the cab hailing apps to the food delivery apps. They all rely on navigational services when it comes to e-commerce or online commerce, right? So navigational information, positional information is critical for civilian application. It's useful in disaster management. It's useful for planning, right? There are many civilian applications you can think of. The same services with greater accuracy can be applied for military purposes as well, especially for guiding missiles, drones, or for conducting targeted military operations, to mobilize your troops or to navigate your naval ships and your aircraft towards a desired target, and to fire targeted missiles, which are guided missiles. Such positional navigational information is critical. So Navik is designed to provide both kinds of services. Navik can provide both the civilian and military services. There is a standard positioning service, which is mainly for commercial purposes with lesser accuracy, slightly lesser accuracy, and a restricted service only for military users, which is very accurate. The civilian service is accurate up to 20 meters with a lag of 40 nanoseconds. This itself is very good accuracy. It is as accurate as the American GPS. The restricted service will be even more accurate with a precision of less than 10 meters. So that accuracy is necessary for military purposes. And to ensure the time accuracy as well, we have developed indigenous atomic clocks which are on board these satellites, because the constellation of satellites have to be in sync. There should be absolute precision in the syncage of their times, and atomic clocks have been indigenously built by ISRO for this purpose. So in Navik, phase 1 was completed when we launched around 7 satellites in this constellation over the last decade. Now we have started with phase 2, where we are expanding the coverage and providing more accurate services. So this is where the second generation of Navik satellites come in, right? So NVS-02 is the second version, right? The second satellite in the second generation. So ISRO is expanding this entire constellation with the Navik series to provide these navigational positional services. Clear? So this was the 100th mission of ISRO, and also there's some interesting data here which you can use in a possible essay or a mains answer. ISRO has till now placed 548 satellites in orbit through 100 launches, and it has carried 120 tons of payload into space, including 23 tons for 433 foreign satellites, especially small micro satellites. I find this data to be a little interesting. If there is a mains question or let's say a essay topic related to India's space achievements or ISRO's achievements, I think you can plug in this fact, this data. Next, the union government is working with the states to provide for the implementation of the labor codes, the 4 labor codes, which are replacing the old outdated labor laws of India. So union government has reviewed the rules that are being drafted and implemented at the state level as far as the labor codes are concerned. So in this context, eShram portal initiative has been launched. Under the eShram portal, microsites for the state and union territories have been launched by the central government, and it has launched a new index called Occupational Shortage Index. So these two topics I feel is relevant for the exam. So what is the eShram portal? The eShram portal was launched in 2021 by Ministry of Labour and Employment. Now under this national portal, microsites are being launched at the state and union territory level. Now, what is this portal? This portal is meant to be a database for unorganized workers in the country. As you know, if you look at the labor force of India, majority of the workforce is in the unorganized sector. So, to provide for their welfare, their well-being, to provide social security to them, and to link them with the demand for labor in the market, to promote their financial inclusion, and to provide them with government welfare and benefits, this portal was created as a database for unorganized workers in the country. So that is the eShram portal, which was launched in 2021. Now, individual microsites are being launched for states and union territories as well as the 4 labor codes come into effect. Next, what is this new index that has been launched? Occupational Shortage Index. The Occupational Shortage Index has been launched by Ministry of Labour and Employment to determine the demand-supply mismatch, the demand for jobs and the supply for jobs available in the market. So this index will help in understanding the requirement of skilled labor and the availability of skilled labor, and the government can use this index. Policy makers, companies and organizations can rely on the index to plan accordingly, because this data is based on ILO methodology. It draws from the International Labour Organization methodology and relies on quarterly data coming from periodic labor force survey to understand how many openings and vacancies are there in the industry, and to link the job seekers with the right jobs and roles. This index would be very crucial. It will provide data-driven insights to understand the shortage that the industry is facing with regard to critical occupations. So Occupational Shortage Index will basically give you the demand supply in the job market. How many vacancies are there? How many job seekers are there? That data would become very clear, which is very useful for policy makers, administrators, and even private companies. So this can help in plugging the gap, ensuring that right people are recruited into the right job, and it can even enable the creation of more jobs, right? And also this can help in capacity building, training and skilling, because accordingly the industry can plan these training programs for upskilling the workforce, the labor force, to make them employment ready by looking at the data and the insights coming from the Occupational Shortage Index. Next, the Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs, which is headed by the Prime Minister, has approved a hike in ethanol procurement price. I hope you're aware that India has an ethanol blending program where we are looking to blend up to 20% ethanol with the standard fuel available in the market. So we are closely approaching this ambitious target day by day. Right now, in many cities, more than 10% ethanol blending is already available. There are cities where almost 15% ethanol blended fuel is available. The ambitious target is to have E20, ethanol 20 fuel available across the country by 2025. Now, blending ethanol has many purposes. It can bring down emissions, thus tackling pollution, helping us meet our climate action targets. More importantly, it can reduce our import bill, because it will reduce our dependency on fossil fuels, on imported crude oil, as we are substituting a part of it with ethanol produced using domestic biostock, right? Using domestic feedstock such as sugarcane molasses, the other organic waste in the industry, right? In the agriculture food industry, ethanol which is produced, if it is blended with fuel, it can play a big role in reducing the demand for petrol and diesel, reducing our import and import bill. So this can save precious foreign exchange for India. it can reduce emissions, tackle pollution, help us achieve our climate action goals, and more importantly, it can benefit the farmers. Farmers can get more income. They can get a remunerative price, right? Because the feedstock for ethanol production comes from the agriculture industry and the food industry. So if the government sets a certain procurement price for ethanol, which guarantees a fair and remunerative price for farmers. So this price has been revised. The Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs has approved a revision in the ethanol procurement price so that farmers will realize more benefits. Farmers will stand to gain from this, as it will increase farmer income and it will help boost ethanol production, and it can help us bring down emissions, tackle pollution, and reduce our import bill. So that is a key development reported here. Coming to the last article for today, the last topic, the Union Cabinet under the Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs has approved an outlay of 16,300 crores for the National Critical Mineral Mission. In last year's budget, Government of India had announced a critical mineral mission. Now the government has made a substantial financial allocation of 16,300 crores to drive the National Critical Mineral Mission of India. See, critical strategic minerals such as lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, and even rare earth minerals, they are in short supply, right? India doesn't have sufficient reserves. And even though we have some minor reserves and deposits, we don't have processing capabilities. For example, we don't have lithium processing capability yet. Though some lithium reserves have been discovered and we are looking to exploit that, we don't have lithium processing capability because the entire lithium supply chain is dominated by few countries such as China. So India is trying to make some advances in this critical domain because these critical strategic minerals are very, very valuable for the future of the industry, especially for electric vehicles, for batteries, for clean renewable energy such as solar and wind, and for critical industries like electronics, defense, aerospace. These minerals are absolutely crucial. So they have a strategic value, not just economic value because of their limited availability in some countries. They have a strategic value because countries are in a race, a geopolitical race, competing over these critical resources. So India has even set up a dedicated public sector unit called KABIL, Khanij Bidesh India Limited, to scout for these critical strategic minerals abroad. For example, we are working with Australia. We are working with few African countries. We are also working with the lithium triangle countries in South America. That includes Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia, to strike mining deals and procure offshore mining assets. For example, KABIL has already secured a lithium brine block in Argentina. We have signed a contract with Argentina in the lithium triangle, and India wants to expand such collaboration with countries that are blessed with critical minerals. So apart from offshore procurement of these mining assets, we want to boost our domestic exploration and production. We also want to focus on recycling of critical strategic minerals. So that is why last year in the union budget, the government announced the critical mineral mission. Now a huge outlay has been provided to drive this mission, so that entities like KABIL can scout for offshore mineral assets for India. We can learn processing technologies from others, especially lithium processing is something that India is missing. See, right now we have a critical dependency on imports from China, as China controls most of the supply chains of critical strategic minerals. We are heavily dependent on China-controlled supply chains. Most of these critical minerals are coming from China-controlled supply chains, lithium, cobalt, etc. That is something we don't like to have because China is known to weaponize its economic advantage for geopolitical gains. So India is always worried, given our hostile relationship in general. There is every possibility that China can misuse this advantage it has to punish India, not only economically, but geopolitically and strategically. So India would like to become self-reliant as much as possible. So we have joined a mineral security partnership with the United States. We are working with other like-minded countries like Japan, Britain, Italy, in the domain of critical strategic minerals. So this mission is going to be crucial for India to drive our offshore assets, to focus on domestic exploration and build our own domestic processing technology, and also to promote recycling. So government will be using these funds primarily to incentivize the private industry. Private mining firms are likely to be incentivized under the mission in the form of tax benefits and subsidies, so that we can give a push for the private sector to focus on critical strategic minerals, not just on mining, but on the processing technology as well. So that is the core purpose of the National Critical Mineral Mission. So this is a big development, and on this note, I bring my discussion to an end. So we have completed some very, very important articles today. I hope all of you have understood the topics, and I hope you guys have liked the session. If you did, please press the like button, share your comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. That is it for today. We'll see you tomorrow. Thanks for watching.